The colony of New Reach sat on the third planet of the Varith system, a quiet world of red soil and blue rivers where 42,000 humans had built something worth keeping. They had farms that stretched for miles across the flat plains. They had schools where children learned math and history and how to fix water pumps. They had a market square in the central town of Port Callum where vendors sold fruit every Sunday morning, and the smell of roasting grain drifted through the streets. They had a small defense station, 3 orbital guns, a handful of patrol ships, and a garrison of 200 soldiers, enough to deal with pirates, enough to feel safe on the edge of known space. They were not safe. Commander Yaros was eating breakfast when the alarms went off. She dropped her fork. She was running before the sound finished echoing through the garrison walls. By the time she reached the command center, her duty officer, a young man named Pitt, was already pale. "What is it?" she said. "Ships," he said. "Lot of ships." The display on the wall showed the outer edge of the Varith system. There were contacts, dozens of them, then hundreds, resolving out of faster than light travel in clean formation. They were big. Each one was bigger than anything the colony's defense station could handle. They moved in perfect rows, the way a military force moves when it is not afraid of anything. "Whose are they?" Doss asked. Pitt looked at the signal signatures on his screen. He had studied alien vessel identification during his training. He recognized the drive signatures. After a few seconds, his face did not change, but his hands went still on the keyboard. "K," he said. "Those are KTH. Dominion warships." Doss had heard of the KTH. Most people living on the edge of colonized space had. They were an empire that had been expanding for 300 years, absorbing smaller species and pushing at the borders of anyone who did not push back hard enough. They had clashed with human ships twice before. Small incidents along disputed transit lanes. Both times the disputes had been settled by diplomats. Both times the KTH had come away with something. "Wanted how many?" she said, counting now. Pitt's fingers moved. 42. "Commander, I'm counting 47 warships. Their lead vessel is broadcasting on open channels. Put it through." The voice that came through the speakers was translated by the station system into flat mechanical English. The KE did not speak in a way that matched human sound. What came through was close enough. "Colony of New Reach, you are on territory claimed under the expansion mandate of the KTH Dominion. You have 4 of your hours to begin evacuation procedures. Any vessels attempting to flee beyond the designated exit corridor will be destroyed. Your defense platform will power down its weapons within 30 minutes or it will be removed. This message will not be repeated." Silence. The command center. Doss looked at the display. 47 warships. Her 3 orbital guns could damage maybe 2 of them if everything clears. Throat went perfectly. Her patrol ships would last minutes. Her 200 soldiers could fight on the ground, but there was no ground fight coming. There would only be fire from above. "Get me Earth command," she said. "Long-range comms are already being jammed." Preach said. "They started as soon as they dropped out of FTL. I can get a tight beam pulse out, very low bandwidth, maybe enough for a text string and a beacon." "Do it," Doss said. "Send everything. Ship counts, signatures, the message they broadcast, our location, everything in the data package. It'll take time to compress Then start now. Das walked to the window outside Port Callum, looked the same as it always did in the morning. The market vendors were setting up their stalls. A group of children was walking toward the school building down the main road. A farmer's transport was moving along the edge of town, loaded with red grain. None of them knew yet. She turned back. Open colony-wide emergency broadcast. The channel clicked open. This is Commander Das. This is not a drill. All civilians are to report to emergency shelter points immediately. Bring water and any documents you can carry. Move calmly. Do not panic. Defense forces are responding. I repeat, this is not a drill. Move to shelter now. She closed the channel. The market vendors stopped moving. The children in the street looked up. The farmers transport slowed and then stopped entirely. Then the running started. Defense station lasted 19 minutes. The crew of Platform Gallant fired all 3 orbital guns in the first 30 seconds. After the KE crossed the inner boundary of the system, they hit one of the smaller KE vessels square on its forward section. It slowed but did not stop. Other 46 ships continued on course. The return fire from the KE fleet turned Platform Gallant into a brief bright point of light in Varith 7's morning sky. The patrol ships scattered. 3 were caught within 2 minutes. The other 4 ran for the exit corridor the KE had designated and were allowed to pass. The K did not want anyone to say later that they had not followed their own rules. The K believed in the appearance of order on the ground. Commander Das had gotten most of the civilian population into the underground shelters. By the time the first K landing craft came down, most, not all, there had not been enough time for everyone. There was never enough time. The K did not bombard the surface. They landed troops. They were thorough and organized. They moved through Port Callum and through the farming settlements and through every structure that showed signs of habitation. They took what they wanted. They destroyed what they did not. Commander Das fought. Her 200 soldiers fought. They held 3 blocks of Port Callum for 6 hours before they were overrun. She was the last one standing in the central command building. She was wounded in her left shoulder and her left leg. She had used all her ammunition. She had a broken piece of a door frame in her hand. A Keth soldier came through the door. It was tall, wider than a human, with 4 arms and a ribbed exoskeleton, the color of old bone. It looked at her. She swung the door frame. It took her down without much effort and left her on the floor. The KTH did not waste effort killing those who could not fight. They moved on. Das lay on the floor of her command center and stared at the ceiling and breathed. The beacon was still transmitting. Pitt had gotten it out. She had seen the confirmation light before. Everything went dark. The tight beam message and the locator beacon were moving through space at the speed of light past the KE jamming field, heading toward the nearest relay station. She had done what she could. The message reached the relay station at the edge of the Varith sector 11 hours later. The relay station's automated systems processed it, recognized the emergency flag, and pushed it up the chain without waiting for human review. That was what the emergency protocol was designed to do. Speed first, verification later. 3 hours after that, the packet arrived at Sector Command on Brennan's World, a mid-size human administrative hub with a population of 8 million and a naval base in its outer Orbit, Admiral Cho Ren was in a meeting about supply logistics when her aide walked in and placed a printed sheet on the table in front of her without saying a word. Printed sheets were for things that could not wait for a screen. She picked it up and read it. The meeting stopped. The data was clear. A colony. World 47 KE military vessels. A formal territorial claim. A destroyed defense station. 42,000 civilians. Choin did not say anything for a long moment. She read the message twice, then she folded the sheet and put it in her uniform pocket. Clear the room, she said. Leave Colonel Marsh and Captain Valdez. Everyone else left. The door closed. Chin stood up and walked to the display wall. She brought up the maps. The Verith system appeared in the corner of a larger grid that showed human-controlled space, 312 colony worlds, 17 home systems, 11 military sectors, and the long corridors of trade routes connecting them all. The KTH hit a colony. Colonel Marsh said he was a careful man who said what he saw and waited for other people to add. Meaning, a colony with 42,000 people on it. Valdez said she was younger than Marsh and not careful at all. Her voice had something hard in it already. Yes. Corin said, this is the third border incident in 8 years, Marsh said. The first 2 were resolved diplomatically. The first 2 did not involve landing troops on a human colony. World, Choin said. The room was very quiet. She pulled the sheet from her pocket and placed it on the table. The beacon data includes KE vessel identification, drive signatures match known KE Dominion military vessels, not privateers, not rogue actors, fleet vessel. This was an authorized action. Marsh nodded slowly. I am forwarding this to Earth Command with my assessment and my recommendation. Chin said, I will be recommending a full military response. Valdez looked at her. A full response? Do you mean what I said? Chin looked at the map, at the scale of it, at the hundreds of glowing points that were human worlds. The KTH Dominion has been testing our borders for 30 years. They tested twice. We answered with diplomats, and they read that as permission to push harder. They have now landed troops on a human colony and displaced or killed 42,000 of our people. She let the silence sit for a moment. If we answer with diplomats again, she said, we will lose another colony within 2 years and another after that, and they will not stop because we keep showing them that the cost is acceptable. She turned away from the map. The cost must not be acceptable. She said, we will send Earth Command the full data package. We will include my recommendation, and then we will wait. The message reached Earth 7 hours later. Earth was 17 light years from Brennan's world, and the relay network was fast. In the Security Council chamber in Geneva, on a planet that humans had lived on for all of recorded history, and before the representatives of the 12 governing bodies of human space sat around a curved table and read Admiral Choin's message in silence. Secretary General Amara then. She put it down on the table. 42,000 people, she said. Yes, said the defense minister beside her, on a world they had been building for 11 years. Yes, she looked at the defense minister. He was a man who had spent 40 years in the military before moving to government. He had a face that had learned not to show much. What are our options? She said. He had prepared for this. He had prepared for this kind of moment for a long time, the way any serious military Organization prepares for the thing it hopes will never come but knows eventually will. We have three options, he said. 1. Diplomatic protest and a demand for withdrawal paired with economic sanctions. 2. A limited military response, a show of force at the Verith system, perhaps seizure of KE assets in disputed transit zones. And 3. Phil said 3 he said is what the KTH Dominion needs to understand we are capable of. He opened the folder in front of him. The third fleet is already on standby at Brennan's world. The 7th and 9th are in range. If we issue a full mobilization order, a wartime order, not a readiness drill, we can draw on all 11 military sectors, every dockyard, every reserve formation, every vessel above patrol class. The room was very still. How many ships? Phil said. He looked at the number on the page. He had looked at it before in briefings and planning documents and dry logistical reports, but saying it aloud in this room felt different. 800,000 warships, he said, counting support vessels, carriers, or drone platforms. 800,000 combat-capable vessels, the largest armed force in human history. Phil sat with that for a moment. Outside the windows of the chamber, Geneva was a normal city on a normal morning. People were going to work, children were going to school, markets were open, life was moving forward the way it always did. 42,000 people on a red-soiled world 300 light years away had been building the same kind of life. Had been called the vote. Phil said the vote was not close. Mobilization order went out at 300 hours Geneva time, and within 6 minutes it had reached every military installation in human space. It did not arrive quietly. 11 sectors, hundreds of naval bases, thousands of dry docks and repair yards and fuel depot and weapon storage facilities spread across 300 light years of claimed space. Order hit all of them at the same moment, and every single one of them began to move. On the orbital station above Brennan's world, Admiral Cho Ren was still at her desk when the reply from Earth came in. She read the authorization code. She read it again to be certain. Then she stood up, walked to her command floor, and gave the order to wake her fleet. The lights in the docking bays came on. Engines began to warm. The third fleet of the human governance, 8,000 vessels of the line, began its departure sequence from Brennan's world. The process took 11 hours. The ships left in groups, sliding out of dock and forming up in the black, one after another, until the formation was so large that the navigational computers had to manage spacing in three-dimensional layers to keep ships from getting too close to each other. It looked from a distance like a small star cluster deciding to go somewhere. Colonel Rashid Mararo had been in the Human Governance Army for 22 years. He had fought in 2 border conflicts, served on 4 different worlds, and spent 3 years as a liaison officer at the War Planning Directorate on Earth, which was where he learned how military organizations actually worked. When they were serious, he was aboard the carrier vessel GNS Unconquered. When the mobilization order arrived, he was reviewing maintenance reports in his cabin. He put the reports aside and walked to the observation deck and stood at the wide viewport and watched what was happening outside. Unconquered was one of 11 carriers in the 3rd Fleet. Each carrier held 240 smaller attack ships in its bays along with troop transport capacity, drone platforms, and enough fuel and ammunition to operate independently for 4 months without resupply. He watched the formation growing in the dark outside. The man standing next to him at the viewport was a young lieutenant named Oe, who had been in the military for 3 years and had never seen a full fleet deployment. How many ships are coming? Oz asked. From all 11 sectors. Marrow looked at the viewport. 800,000. OC was quiet for a moment. He had heard the number in the briefing, but hearing it and seeing it were different things. Even watching the Third Fleet form up, 8,000 ships, was already something that did not look real. It looked like a simulation. Have we ever done this before? Oy said. No. Marrow said. Has anyone? Marrow thought about it. He had read military history as part of his training and as a personal interest for most of his adult life. He knew of large fleet actions, large armies, large-scale conflicts, going back centuries of human expansion into space. Not like this, he said. KTH Dominion had an intelligence network. They had agents and informants and listening posts scattered through the border regions of human space, which was standard practice for any expanding empire. Information was as valuable as ships, and the KTH understood this well. Their primary intelligence assessor for the human border region was a KE administrator named Vrethka, who had been watching human movements for 11 years from a station near the edge of KE controlled space. Vreka was experienced and cautious and took a measured view of most things. When the first reports came in about the mobilization order, Vreka flagged them as significant but not alarming. Humans responded to territorial actions with political noise. It was expected. The expansion council back in KTHSB space had anticipated a political response, protests through diplomatic channels, possibly a formal objection filed with the multi-SES mediation bodies, perhaps economic pressure on KE commercial vessels in shared transit lanes. Then the second wave of reports came in. Breath read through them carefully. Reports from multiple listening posts, reports from informants at human docking facilities, fuel requisitions, weapons transfers, dry docked vessels suddenly being brought back to active status, reserve formations being called up, construction alert on 3 of the largest shipyards in the Brennan sector, working around the clock. Brethka looked at the numbers for a long time. Then Brethka sent an urgent message to the Expansion Council, not a flagged report. An urgent message. The difference was significant in the KE bureaucracy. The message said, "This is not a political response. Recommend immediate review." Back in human space, the ships kept coming. The 7th Fleet departed from the Orion Reach sector, sweeping through 3 transit corridors in formation. The 9th Fleet moved out of its bases near the Halcyon worlds, 90,000 vessels, in a column that stretched across 4 light hours of space. The reserve formation's older ships refitted and restocked joined the main bodies at assembly points designated in the mobilization plan. The mobilization plan had been written 40 years ago by a committee of military planners who believed, as military planners always do, that the worst case should be prepared for even if no one expected it to happen. The plan had been revised every 5 years since it had been tested. In simulations, it had been reviewed, updated, argued over, and revised again. Nobody had thought it would ever actually be used. It was being used now. Commander Yara Das, who had survived the fall of New Reach with a broken shoulder and a limp she would carry for the rest of her life, was transferred from KE captivity to a neutral medical station 6 weeks after the attack as part of a brief prisoner exchange that Keth agreed to before they understood what was happening. She arrived thin and quiet and slower than she used to be. She was debriefed at a military hospital. On Brennan's world, she answered every question they asked her. She gave them everything. The exact timing of the attack, the formation the KET ships had used, the way their landing troops had moved through the streets, the weapons they had carried, the behavior of individual soldiers, every detail she had stored in her memory during the hours she had spent on the floor of her command center. The intelligence officers thanked her and left. She sat alone in her hospital room for a while. Then a junior aide came in with a data tablet and showed her the current state of the mobilization, ship counts, sector deployments, fleet positions. She looked at the numbers at the scale of what was assembling out in the dark. When did this start? She said the order went out 6 days after the attack. Commander, the aide said 6 days. She had been in K custody, not knowing. She had assumed the response would be what it had always been before: protest, diplomatic notes, maybe sanctions. She looked at the screen for a long time. Good, she said. Her voice was flat and quiet and did not need to be anything else. On Earth, the Secretary General was facing pressure from two sides. Several of the governing bodies had signed the vote for full mobilization, but now that the machinery was actually in motion, some of them were sending representatives to her office to ask if there was still time to open a diplomatic channel. The KTH had not responded to the mobilization with any direct communication, which some read as fear and others read as indifference. Either way, the argument was made. Perhaps the fleet itself was enough. Perhaps showing 800,000 warships was the message, and the ships would not actually have to fight. Phil listened to all of them. She sat in meetings and heard their arguments. She understood their concerns. War was not a small thing. 800,000 warships crossing human space toward K territory was not a small thing. People would die, not just soldiers. War always spread further than its intended edges. She understood all of it, and she called in her defense minister and asked him one question: if we stop now, if we pull back, open talks, accept a settlement that lets the K keep what they took at Verath, what happens in 5 years? He did not hesitate. He had the same answer Chin had given weeks before, and the same answer the war planners had put in every long-term threat assessment for the past 30 years. They test again, he said, further, harder, against a world with more people on it. She nodded. Then we continue. The fleet assembly took 63 days. 63 days of ships moving through transit corridors, lining up at rally points, fueling and arming, and running final systems checks. 63 days of dock workers and logistics officers and supply chain managers working around the clock to push food, water, fuel, and ammunition into the largest military formation in the history of human civilization. At the end of 63 days, the fleet was ready. Admiral Chon had been given command of the overall operation. She accepted the appointment without ceremony. She had a job to do. Ceremony was for after she stood on the command deck of her Flagship the GNS remorseless and looked at the tactical display. The display showed the assembled fleet in simplified form, thousands of dots, arranged in the rough shape of an advancing column broken into subfleets and task groups and specialized formations, 800,000 warships plus the drone platforms, 3 million. Autonomous combat drones, each one the size of a small patrol ship, worked together and capable of operating without direct human input, plus the carrier groups, each one holding hundreds of smaller vessels in its bays, plus the artillery ships, which were not subtle things. They were massive and slow and carried weapons that could crack the crust of a planet from orbit, if that was what was needed. Though Chin intended it to never come to that, she looked at the display for a while, then she looked at the message that had arrived an hour ago from Vreka Station, intercepted by human intelligence, decoded with no great difficulty. The KE were asking for talks. She picked up the response form. She filled it out. Response was 2 sentences. There will be no talks until New Reach colony is fully evacuated by KETH forces and all displaced persons are returned to human custody. This condition must be met within 48 hours. She sent it. She did not expect compliance. The Keth Dominion did not operate on a model of compliance. They operated on a model of strength. They would read the message, evaluate the threat, and decide whether the threat was real. She intended to make it real. Fleet status, she said to her navigation officer. All groups report ready, Admiral. Plot the transit course to Kethes, already plotted. Admiral, she sat down in her command chair. Then let's go, she said. Fleet moved, 800,000 warships plus support groups plus their drones and carriers and artillery platforms entered the transit corridors and began the journey toward KTH space. The KE had informants near enough to the assembly points that the departure was not a surprise. Bretha had been sending urgent messages for weeks. The expansion council had received all of them. They had not believed the numbers. That was the problem. They had looked at the reports of 800,000 ships and assumed that the number was exaggerated, inflated by human propaganda or by an informant trying to increase their own value. Nobody built 800,000 warships. It was not a real number. It was a political number, a scare number. The council authorized their border fleets to go to high readiness. They sent a message to the human diplomatic channel asking if there was room for negotiation. They continued to hold New Reach colony with their garrison forces because backing down was not something the KTH Dominion did in response to threats that had not yet proven themselves real. The fleet kept coming. Lieutenant Osi stood at the observation deck on GNS Unconquered and watched the transit corridor close around the ship. The strange stretch visual effect of faster than light travel, the stars elongating into lines, the sense of distance being folded like paper. How long to Keth space? He asked. Transit time is 18 days, Colonel Marrow said. Beside him, then we drop out at the edge of their border systems, and then Marrow was quiet for a moment. Then they'll see us, he said, all of us in their space, and they'll understand what they did. OC thought about that. He thought about the 42,000 people on New Reach. He thought about the colony, the farms, the market square, the children walking to school. On a Sunday, he had read the briefing documents. He had seen the censor records from the surviving patrol ships that had made it out through the designated corridor. Do you think they knew, he said, when they hit that colony? Do you think they knew what was going to come? Merrill thought about it. Honestly, no, he said. I don't think they had any idea. The transit corridor stretched around them. The stars were lines of light in the dark. Somewhere behind them, hundreds of thousands of other ships were making the same jump, filling the dark, moving forward. The Keth Dominion had taken a colony. Now something was coming for them that had no name in their language because they had never had to name it before. They had never caused it before. In 300 years of expansion and dominance and careful, organized conquest, they had never done the one thing that it turned out you should never do. They had killed human civilians. They had burned human homes. They had not known what that would wake. They were about to find out. The KE border system of Rithalin was a quiet place. It held 2 inhabited worlds, KE administrative planet and a small mining colony for a subject species called the VETH, who had been under KE authority for 80 years. There was a military station in the outer orbit of the system's largest gas giant and a patrol fleet of 200 vessels that swept the border lanes every 40 standard hours. The patrol captain on duty when the human fleet arrived was a veteran officer named Keth Orth, who had spent 20 years in border service and had seen most of what the border had to offer. He had dealt with human ships before, small ones usually, traders and scouts, and the occasional military patrol that wandered too close. Humans were manageable. They were loud in diplomatic channels and quiet in person. Kether was running his standard patrol sweep when his sensors lit up. 1 contact, then 10, then 100. Then the numbers stopped making sense. His sensor officer read out the count, and then stopped and read it again, and then turned and looked at Keth Orth with an expression that Keth Orth had not seen on a trained officer's face before. How many? Kireth said. The count is still climbing, the sensor officer said. I don't. It's still climbing, Captain. The contacts were dropping out of transit all across the approach vector, not in a line, in a wall. 3-dimensional wall of ships spreading across the boundary of the system in every direction, filling the sensor display from edge to edge. The patrol station's automated systems were trying to assign tracking identifiers to each contact and failing to keep up with the rate of arrival. Get me the border command, Keith said. Sir, the border command is already calling us. He took the channel. The border command's duty officer sounded exactly the way Cather felt, like someone who had just looked out a window expecting to see a street and had instead seen the ocean. What is your contact count? The border commander said. Still climbing, Keth said. We're past 100,000. The system is still tracking. A long silence. Hold your position, the border commander said. Do not engage. I am contacting the Expansion Council. The message reached the Expansion Council 19 minutes later. It was flagged at the highest emergency level. The KE communication system had a level that had not been used since the internal civil conflict of 80 years before. The council was in session, a routine meeting about supply chains for the outer expansion territories. The session stopped. Council head Breth Ammon read the message. He was a political creature, not a military one, which meant he was good at managing information and bad at absorbing things that fell outside his understanding of how the world worked. He read the message twice. He looked at the attached sensor data from the border station, 800,000 ships. He looked at his military advisor, High Commander Sorrel Keith, who was the most experienced military mind in the Dominion and who had served for 50 years. Sorrel Keth was already looking at her own data feed. Her face was the careful, controlled face of a soldier who had trained away most visible reactions, but her hands on the table in front of her were very still, and the stillness was its own reaction. Is this real? Breath Ammon said. Yes, Sorrel Keth said. Our border intelligence said the mobilization numbers were likely exaggerated. Our border intelligence was wrong. He looked at the display again. The contacts were still arriving at the border system, still dropping out of transit. The sensor data showed them spreading outward from the initial entry point, like a tide filling a bay. Can we fight them? He said. Sorrel Keth was quiet for a moment. She was doing math in her head, real math, not the optimistic math of political documents. The KTH Dominion's total military fleet was approximately 80,000 warships. It was a number that had made them the dominant power in their region of space for 3 generations. It was a number that up until this moment had been comfortably larger than any force they might need to deal with. The humans had 10 times that number at the border right now. No, she said. The word landed on the table like something solid. The human fleet had been at the border for 4 hours when they opened a communication channel. Admiral Cho Ren was on the command deck of Remorseless. The channel opened and the translated voice of a K official came through. This is High Commander Sorrel Keth of the Keth Dominion Defense Forces. I'm requesting to speak with the commanding officer of the human fleet. You're speaking to her, Chin said. I am Admiral Chin. A brief pause. Admiral, we wish to discuss a resolution to the current situation at Vareth 7. The Expansion Council is prepared to withdraw military forces from the colony in exchange for a ceasefire and the opening of formal negotiation. Chin looked at her communications officer, who was recording everything. I sent a condition before the fleet departed, she said. Full withdrawal from New Reach and return of all displaced persons. That condition has not been met. The KE garrison is still on the planet. Our people are still in your custody. We are prepared to begin that process as part of an agreement. Sorrel Keth said. We ask that the fleet withdraw to a neutral distance while the process is underway. No, Chin said. Silence on the channel. Admiral, you will withdraw your forces from New Reach colony without conditions. Chin said. You will release all human prisoners in your custody without conditions. You will do both of these things within the next 24 hours. These are not negotiating points. They are requirements. If they are met, the fleet will hold its position, and we will then discuss what happens next. If they are not met, the fleet will advance. Another silence. If the fleet advances into Kespace, this becomes a war. Sorketh said. Yes, Choin said. You would start a war over one colony. Choin thought about 42,000 people. She thought about Commander Yorotas on the floor of her command center. She thought about children walking to school on a Sunday morning on a red-soiled world. You started this, she said. We are just deciding how it ends. She closed the channel. 21 hours later, the KTH had not complied. The Expansion Council had argued through the night. Sorrel Keth had pushed for compliance. She had laid out the military situation in terms that did not leave room for comfortable misreading. Breath Ammon had pushed back. The Dominion did not comply under threat. If they complied under threat, every species on the border would see it. The Dominion's authority rested on a foundation of demonstrated strength. To back down from a threat was to invite every subject species and every border nation to test them. Bretham's argument was not wrong. It was just addressed to a problem that was no longer the main problem. Soroketh understood this. He made the argument again more clearly. The fleet had not moved during the 21 hours it had held position at the border system, filling the sensor space of the KE border station with 800,000 contacts, but it had not come further in. When the 24-hour mark passed, it moved. Keith watched the display. The fleet had been sitting at the border for most of a day, a wall of contacts so large that his sensor team had stopped trying to track individual ships and was just monitoring the overall mass of them. It was like watching a storm front. The individual raindrops didn't matter. The front mattered. When the front began to move, his communications officer was already on the channel to Border Command. They're advancing, she said. I see it. Cathora said he watched the contacts come forward. His 200 patrol ships were still in formation. They had been told to hold position and not engage unless fired upon. He intended to follow those orders. 200 ships against 800,000 was not a military decision. It was a footnote. The human fleet came in without firing a shot. It did not need to fire a shot. The border patrol moved aside. The mining colony on the inner world transmitted a surrender signal before anyone asked for one. The military station near the gas giant powered down its weapons. The human fleet passed through the Brethren system and kept going. Word spread through the Keth Dominion the way word always spreads when a certainty breaks. It started at the border, moved to the military networks, leaked from the military networks to the civilian communication systems, and then was everywhere at once. 800,000 human warships in KTH space, moving inward, not stopping, not negotiating. Species under KTH authority picked it up on their own communication networks. VETH on the mining world had sent their own messages, transmitted in their own language to their own people on a dozen other worlds. As soon as the human fleet appeared at the border, the Drethian, who had been under K authority for 140 years, received the news on their home world and did not say anything publicly. But their administrators stopped answering messages from K Command. The Seth Lore, a small species on the eastern rim of the Dominion, sent a message to the human fleet communication address asking about the possibility of opening talks. Sorketh watched the Dominion beginning to wobble at the edges. She had seen this pattern in historical records, the records of empires, her own and others. There was always a moment when an empire that had been built on strength encountered something stronger, and the moment did not break the empire all at once. It cracked it. The cracks spread from the edges inward, and by the time the center felt them, it was too late for the center to do much about it. She sent another message to Admiral Choyne. Our fleet will not oppose your advance, she said. I am asking only that you agree to a formal surrender process rather than an uncontrolled advance for the safety of civilian populations on both sides. Chin read the message on her command deck. She thought about it for a few minutes. She called her senior officer. She asked for their views. Colonel Rashid Marrero aboard the carrier Unconquered was patched into the discussion. He listened to the debate and then said the people of New Reach didn't get a formal process. No one argued with that, but Choin was not a person who let anger run the operation. Anger was for after. We will observe a formal surrender protocol, she replied. To Sorrel Keth, any KE military vessel or installation that powers down its weapons and transmits a surrender signal will be treated according to the laws of war. Civilian populations will not be targeted. We are not here to burn worlds. We are here to end the force that burned ours. She paused, then added, one more line. Release New Reach Colony. All prisoners now, not in 24 hours now. Do this and we will talk about what comes after. Don't do it and we will talk about nothing. The reply from Sorrel Keth came back in 30 minutes. The withdrawal order has been issued to the New Reach garrison. Prisoner release orders are being transmitted. I am personally guaranteeing compliance. I ask that you acknowledge receipt so that I can show this acknowledgement to the council. Chin acknowledged it. Then she looked at the tactical display and the fleet and the deep space ahead of her, and she said nothing for a while. Lieutenant Osi was on the command deck. He had been assigned there as part of an observer rotation. He had been watching. He had seen everything. Is it over? He asked Colonel Marrero quietly so that the admiral would not hear. Marrero looked at the display. The fleet was still moving. The K border was behind them. The interior of Keth's base was ahead. The colony is being released, he said. That part is over, but the fleet is still going forward, Ase said. Yes, Marrero said. Then what are we going toward? Marrero thought about the 30 years of test and push and diplomatic settlement. He thought about the pattern of it. He thought about what Chin had said in the briefing, not to the public, not to the K, but to her senior officers. Before the fleet left human space, she had said, a lesson is only learned when the cost of forgetting it is too high. We're going to make sure they don't forget. Marrero said. The fleet kept moving. Deep in Keth space, the lights of the Dominion burned in the dark. Worlds of millions, administrative centers, military installations, civilization 300 years in the making. All of it was watching something come toward it that it had never seen before. And in the red soil and blue rivers of New Reach Colony, the first transports were landing, human ships in a system. The KAT were now very quickly leaving, and the people who were coming out of the underground shelters were walking into the light, and the market square was still there, damaged but standing, and the school building had lost part of its roof, but the walls were intact. The red soil had not changed. The blue rivers had not changed. The people walking into the light looked at the sky where the Keth ships were now departing, and they looked at the human ships landing, and they breathed the air of their world. And they did not need to say anything. They already knew what was coming behind them. 800,000 ships, it was enough. The first battle of the campaign was not a battle. The K military base at Orth 7 had a garrison of 200 vessels and a ground force large enough to hold a planet against standard assault. It was one of the strongest KE military Positions on the inner border, a fortress that the Dominion had spent 40 years building, and that had never been seriously threatened when the human fleet's advance column arrived. Just the advance column, 300,000 ships, the base commander transmitted his surrender signal within 3 minutes. His name was Velkorn, and he was not a coward. He had fought in 5 campaigns. He had a commendation from the council and a scar that ran from his left shoulder to his lower back from a boarding action 20 years before. He was a soldier who understood what soldiers could do and what they could not. 300,000 ships was not a thing you fought. He transmitted the signal, powered down his weapons as required by the protocol, and then sat in his command chair and waited. He told his crew to stand down. He told his ground troops to put their weapons on the ground. He told the civilian workers on the base to go to the designated safe areas and wait for instructions from the human forces. Then he waited. The human ships came in slowly and organized. Boarding teams arrived at the base in sealed transports. They moved through the corridors quickly, professionally. They secured the weapon stores. They took data from the base systems. They treated the Keth soldiers with a cold, careful handling of a force that has a job to do and does not hate you enough to hurt you when there is no reason to. Velker was taken to a processing area, along with the rest of the garrison officers. He sat in a line of K soldiers, waiting to be processed and registered as prisoners of war. The human soldier who processed him was a young woman with short hair and a tired expression. She checked his identification, registered his name, recorded his rank, and assigned him a prisoner number. She did all of this without particular emotion. Your crew, she said, 1,200 all. Surrendered, he said. Any wounded? No fighting. She looked up at him. Briefly, she had heard the same answer at 4 other surrendered bases in the past 2 days. You'll be transported to a holding facility in accordance with the laws of war, she said. You'll be fed. Your medical needs will be seen to, and you'll be held until the situation is resolved. Do you understand? Yes, he said. She marked his file and moved to the next person. Velkorn sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor and thought about the expansion council, which had taken a colony with 47 ships and had started something that 4,700 ships could not have stopped, let alone 47,000. He thought about what Verith Ammon had said about the need to demonstrate strength, about the danger of backing down from threats. He thought about how that had worked out. Not all of the KTH Dominion's military commanders chose to surrender. Fleet Admiral Drathan had been fighting for the Dominion for 40 years. He had conquered 3 worlds and broken 2 resistance movements. He had received the Dominion's highest military honor twice. He was 63 years old, and he had decided somewhere in the 2 weeks between the human fleet's arrival at the border and its push into the Dominion's interior that he was not going to end his career handing his sword to a human officer. He assembled his available forces at the KTH system of Vorthanner, the 5th planet of the system, where the Dominion's main military shipyard was located. He had 8,000 vessels. He positioned them in a defensive formation around the shipyard. He sent a message to Admiral Choyne saying that he would not surrender and that any human vessel that entered the Vorthanner system would be fired upon. Chin read the message. She did not want to fight. Fights killed. People on both sides. She had not come here to prove that humans were better at killing than the KTH. She had come here to prove something more specific and more permanent than that. She tried 3 times to reach Drathson on open channels. He did not respond. She sent his message to Sorrel Keith and asked if the Keth Defense Forces would remove him from his position. Sorrel Keth replied that Drathson was acting independently and that the Defense Forces could not physically prevent him from fighting if he chose to fight. Chin looked at the tactical display. She looked at the formation around the Voronezh shipyard. 8,000 ships, Task Group 7 to Voronezh. She said full combat authorization. Task Group 7 was 20,000 ships. The battle lasted 9 hours. Drathon fought the way a career soldier fights when they know they are going to lose and have decided that the losing matters more than the surviving. He held his formation together for 6 hours before the human flanking movements broke it into sections. He burned through his ammunition reserves trying to hold the shipyard. He lost ships in 1s and 2s, and then in dozens. The human fleet lost 63 ships. It was 63 ships out of 20,000. But each one of those ships had a crew, and the crew had names. Cho Ren was given the casualty list that evening. She read every name on it. Drathon's flagship broadcast a distress signal in the 7th hour when its engines failed. Human boarding teams responded. They found Drathson on the command deck, wounded, unwilling to leave his chair. He was extracted by force and treated for his wounds. He was processed like all the others. Name, rank, prisoner. Number. The soldier who processed him did not know or care who he was. He was just another entry in the log. The Voronezh shipyard was seized intact. It was among the largest shipyards in Caspace, built to produce warships at scale. The human forces secured it and placed it in holding until the situation was resolved. Colonel Marrow walked through the facility with an engineering team 2 days later. He was not a ship building expert, but he understood military infrastructure. The shipyard was impressive. It was clearly built by people who took the business of making weapons seriously. What happens to it? Lieutenant O.C. asked, walking beside him. Depends on the settlement, Marrow said. Probably mothball, may be converted. O.C. looked at the empty docks. We really took the whole thing. Yes, and we're still going. Yes, they were still going. The fleet had split into task groups by the 3rd week of the advance. Individual groups moved through the Dominion systems the way water moves through cracks, finding the open paths, flowing around the hard points, securing the key infrastructure. The Keth Dominion had never had to think about defending all of its own interior. Simultaneously, it had built its military for expansion, for pushing outward. Its defensive doctrine assumed that any threat would come from the border, could be identified, and could be met at a point. There was no point to meet this at. There was everywhere. Communications between K systems became unreliable as human forces took control of relay stations and communication hubs, not to destroy them. Chin's standing order was to damage nothing that did not need to be damaged, but to route communications through human monitoring systems. She wanted to know what was being said. She wanted the Keth to know that she wanted to know that knowledge was its own pressure. The species under KE authority began to act. The VATH, who had been on the mining colony at the border, had been sending messages to Human Fleet Command since Day 1. They were a small species, 40 million total population across 6 worlds, and they had been subject to Keth rule since before any living vet person had been born. They were careful in their messages because they had learned over generations that hope was a thing that could be taken away if you expressed it too openly, but they made contact. They provided information about KE troop dispositions on their worlds. They asked about the possibility of support. The Drethian took a more direct approach on the second K administrative world, a planet called Kethful. The Drathian administrative workers who the KE had employed for decades because they were efficient and cheap and had no history of resistance, simply stopped working on the day the human fleet reached the system. Not a strike, not a protest. They just stopped. They went home. Every Drethian and every KE controlled facility on the planet went home and stayed there. The KE administration on the planet tried to find replacement workers. There were none. The KE had not planned for this because the Drethian had never done this before. In 80 years of administration, there had been no mass work stoppage. The human fleet arrived at the system 2 days later and found the Keth administration paralyzed and the planet's infrastructure running on skeleton operations. High Commander Sorok Keth, watching from her command post, added another line to the list of things that had gone wrong. In the fourth week, Breath Ammon called a full council session. The agenda was simple. The human fleet was now past the outer and middle ring of KE systems. It had encountered serious resistance at only 2 points. Voronor, where Drathan had chosen to fight, and a second engagement at the border of the KTH home system cluster, where a group of commanders who did not report to Sorokith had attempted to organize a combined defense. The combined defense had lasted 14 hours. Breath Ammon looked around the table at the council members. Some of them had been with him since the beginning. Some of them had voted for the new Reach operation. Enthusiastically, they had believed sincerely that a quick territorial acquisition would strengthen the Dominion's position and give it leverage in ongoing border disputes with 3 smaller human sector entities. They had believed the humans would respond the way every other species had responded. Protests, diplomacy, eventual acceptance. It had seemed so certain. The military situation is unrovable. Sorrel Keith said she was not being dramatic. She was a soldier describing a field. The human fleet is moving toward the home systems. Our available forces cannot stop it. 3 of our border allies have already sent notes of neutrality to the human fleet command. The Vet are cooperating with the humans actively. The Drethian have stopped functioning as a controlled population. The supply chains for the outer expansion territories are breaking down because the humans now control the transit corridors. She looked at the council. We have one option available that is not worse than all other options, she said. Everyone in the room knew what the option was. Nobody wanted to say it first. Brethren Ammon looked at the tactical display on the wall. The display showed the Cathome system cluster, 5 worlds, billions of people, the center of the Dominion, the beating heart of 300 years of history and power and expansion. The human fleet was 3 transit jumps away. He thought about the colony on Varith 7, 42,000 People a market square, children. Walking to school, he thought about how simple the decision had seemed at the time. Open a channel to Admiral Choin. He said the channel opened. He had prepared a statement, a diplomatic statement carefully worded that framed the request in terms of mutual interest and the shared desire to prevent unnecessary loss of life. He had written it himself. He had practiced it. He looked at the image of Cho Ren on the channel and began speaking. She let him finish. I hear your request, she said. I want to be clear about what I am prepared to discuss and what I am not. Her voice was level. It had been level in every communication he had heard from her. He did not know if this was a military manner or simply her manner. He suspected it was both. I am prepared to stop the fleet advance immediately, she said, if the council agrees to a formal surrender and accepts the terms of a settlement that my government will present. If you agree in principle now, I will halt the advance and give you time to review the terms before signing. He breathed. And if we don't agree, he said. She looked at him across the channel. Then the fleet continues, she said, and we have the same conversation in 3 days when we're closer. He had nothing to say to that. We agree in principle, he said. The fleet stopped. The guns went quiet, and in the silence, the stars were full of human ships. Settlement negotiations took 11 days. They were held aboard a neutral station in the Voronezh system, the one with the captured KE shipyard, because Cho Ren chose the location, and she chose it deliberately. Every time the KE delegation looked out the station's viewports, they could see the sea shipyard floating in the dark with human vessels moving in and out of its docks. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. The KE delegation was led by Sarl Keth, not Breth Ammon. He had asked to lead it himself as head of the council, and Sarl Keth had told him with the particular calm of a military person explaining something to a politician that he should not be at the table, that his presence would complicate things, that she had a better chance of reaching an agreement that the Dominion could accept. He had not argued. He had lost the authority to argue about much. Sorrel Keth sat across from Admiral Cho Ren and the human government's chief negotiator, a small quiet woman named Dr. Farah Elland, who had spent 30 years doing exactly this kind of work. Ellen did not look like the person who was going to rewrite the terms of an entire empire's existence. She looked like someone who taught mathematics at a small university. She had kind eyes and a voice that stayed calm no matter what was said across the table. The first 3 days were spent on the framework. What was on the table and what was not. What was not on the table, the dissolution of the K Dominion. Chin had made this clear in the opening session. Humans were not here to destroy a civilization. They were not going to take Keth worlds or install human administration over KTH people. The Dominion would continue to exist as a political entity. Sarlketh listened to this and said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer, the relief of someone who had been bracing for worse. What was on the table? Everything else. The full text of the settlement was long and detailed in the way that serious agreements always are, but the core of it was simple enough to say in a few sentences. The KTH Dominion would withdraw from all territories it had occupied by force in the past 50 years that belonged to species that had not voluntarily joined the Dominion. This included the worlds of the VTH, the Drethian, and 9 other species. These species would be free to form their own governments, enter into voluntary trade agreements, and determine their own futures without KT interference. The KTH Dominion would pay reparations to New Reach Colony, reconstruction costs, compensation for every person who had been displaced or harmed, and a fund for the families of those who had died. The amount was significant. It was calculated by the human government's economists to be exactly as much as the Dominion could pay without breaking its economy, not more, not less. The number was chosen to hurt without destroying the Keth. Dominion's military would be reduced to a defensive force, enough ships and troops to protect its own worlds against external threats, but no offensive capacity beyond that. The new limits would be verified by the multi-SEs inspection body that would include representatives of the species that Keth had held. This was Ellen's contribution to the settlement, and it was the part that Sorrel Keth pushed back on hardest. An inspection body that includes the VTH and the Drithian, Sorrel Keth said, is an inspection body designed to find violations regardless of whether they exist. An inspection body that doesn't include them is one that none of the freed species will trust, and if they don't trust it, they will look for other guarantees. You do not want to find out what those other guarantees look like. Sorrel Keth sat with that. We accept the inspection body, she said. The last point of the settlement was the one that Chin had added herself personally, against the advice of 2 of her senior staff who thought it was unnecessarily harsh. She had listened to their advice and then kept the clause anyway. The clause said, the KE Dominion acknowledges in formal and public terms that the attack on New Reach Colony was an act of aggression against a civilian population. This acknowledgement will be transmitted on all KE public channels and will be included in the official historical record of the Dominion. Sorrel Keth read that clause 3 times. This is not a military or economic condition, she said. This is political. Yes, Chin said. You want us to tell our own people that we were wrong? Yes. A long silence. Why does this matter to you? Sorrel Keth said. She was genuinely asking. She was a military person and she understood military conditions. This one felt different. Chin thought about how to say it. Because in 30 years, when someone in your council looks at a human colony on a border world and thinks about expanding your territory, she said, they will be able to look up in your own records that you did this before, that you called it justified, that you lost everything that followed from it. And the record will say in your own words that you were wrong. Sorrel Keith looked at her for a moment. You want us to remember, she said. Yes, Kren said. Sorrel Keith signed. The fleet began its withdrawal from Kethspace 2 days after the settlement was signed. It did not leave all at once. That would have taken too long and created logistical chaos in the transit corridors. Task Group pulled back and organized waves the way they had come, methodically in sequence, each group moving to staging point and then to a transit corridor home. The process took 3 weeks. For 3 weeks the CAV systems watched the human ships departing. They watched the fleet thin out group by group, the sensor contacts dropping off the displays. The border systems watched the last ships cross back into human space. The relay stations that had been under human monitoring were handed back. The shipyard at Voronor was handed back as well stripped of military equipment per the settlement terms, but otherwise intact. Breath Amun watching the withdrawal from his office in the council building did not feel what he had expected to feel. He had expected relief. He had expected the particular release of someone who has been under enormous pressure and watched the pressure lift. He felt something older and quieter than relief. He thought about the 42,000 people on New Reach. He thought about the meeting where the Expansion Council had discussed the Verastum, one of many systems discussed. That session, reviewed for territorial value, assessed for risk, approved for action, a routine meeting, a routine decision he had not thought much about. The people living there at the time, it had not seemed like the relevant information. He thought about it now. The freed species were watched closely by everyone in that region of space. Vet were first. They were the smallest. 40 million people, 6 worlds, no military to speak of. Within 3 months of the settlement, they had held the first free elections in their recorded history. The result was a government that looked, by human political standards, fairly chaotic. Multiple parties, no clear majority, loud public arguments about everything. It looked like freedom. The Drethian were more cautious. They had been controlled for 140 years. They had people alive today whose great-grandparents had been the last to remember what self-governance felt like, and those memories were indirect, passed down through family stories that had been simplified by time. They formed a provisional government and moved carefully and asked the human governance for advice on several points without asking for control, which was the right balance. The 9 other species did 9 different things. Some formed governments quickly, some struggled. One had a brief internal conflict over who the legitimate leadership should be, conflict that resolved after some difficult weeks without violence. The Multi-Esses inspection body formed and began its work. The KE cooperated because they understood that non-operations would bring the fleet back, and once a lesson is learned at that cost, it tends to stay learned. Sorrel Keth retired from the Defense Forces 6 months after the settlement. She had been in uniform for 50 years. She wrote a memoir that was, by the standards of military memoirs, unusually honest. She described the Keths' assumptions about human behavior, the belief that humans would respond to territorial aggression the way smaller species did, with protest and accommodation. She described the moment she saw the contact count at the border and understood that the assumption had been wrong. The memoir was read widely, both in the Dominion and outside it. It was translated into 22 languages. Several universities used it in courses on military strategy and political miscalculation. In one chapter, she described her conversation with Admiral Choyne about the Acknowledgement Clause. She said she wanted us to remember Toril. Keth wrote, at the time I thought this was the demand of a victorious party seeking symbolic satisfaction. I understand now that it was strategy, the most long-term strategy of the entire campaign. Everything else, the ships, the battles, the fleet at our border, was force. The Acknowledgement Clause was deterrence. It was the thing designed to make the next council think twice before approving the next colonial action. It cost the humans nothing. It will cost any K leader who forgets it everything. That is elegant. I wish I had thought of it. Admiral Cho Ren returned to Earth 6 months after the fleet withdrew. There was a ceremony, there were speeches. The Secretary General spoke about the campaign and about its outcome, about the freed species, about the settlement, about the 42,000 people of New Reach who were rebuilding their colony on their red-soiled world. Chin sat in the front row and listened to all of it. She was in her dress uniform, which she wore rarely enough that it still felt slightly strained. She was 61 years old, and she was tired in the way that people are tired after a thing is finally done. Not the exhaustion of effort, but the settling weight of completion. She thought about the 63 ships she had lost at Voronezh, the names on the casualty list. She thought about that every day. She would probably think about it every day for the rest of her life. That was the weight you carried when you sent people into a fight, even a fight that needed to happen. When the ceremony was over, a young reporter caught her at the edge of the hall and asked if she had a moment. She had a moment. What was the most important decision of the campaign? The reporter asked. She thought about it. The mobilization order, the refusal to halt the advance when the KE first asked, the condition she had set, the acknowledgement clause stopping. She said. The reporter looked confused. Stopping when Breath Ammon called in, asked to surrender. We stopped. The fleet was 3 jumps from their home systems. We could have kept going. We could have taken everything. She looked at the wall of the hall for a moment. We stopped. Why does that matter? The reporter said. Because the galaxy is watching. She said. It has been watching since the first ship crossed the border. Every species within range of a news feed has been watching what we do. They needed to see that we could be stopped, that we chose to stop, that we are not an empire looking for an excuse. She looked at the reporter. The fleet was the message to the K. She said. Stopping was the message to everyone else. Commander Yara Das was back on New Reach Colony when the reconstruction was mostly complete. She had been offered a promotion and a posting at Sector Command. She had considered it for about 4 days before declining. She had told her commanding officer that she had a job to finish. He had not argued. Market Square in Port Callum was rebuilt. The roofing on the school building was repaired. The farms were coming back. Some of them had been damaged in the fighting. Some had just been neglected for months, but the red soil was good and the Blue River still ran clear. On the first Sunday after the market reopened, she stood at the edge of the square and watched the vendors set up their stalls, fruit and roasted grain and the small handmade things that people make when they live somewhere long enough to care about it. Children were running between the stalls. The smell of roasting grain was in the air. She had a limp. She would always have it. The shoulder had healed mostly, but mostly was its own kind of answer. She bought a piece of fruit from a vendor and ate it standing in the sun. The sky was clear somewhere up there, past the blue of the atmosphere, past the thin cold space above, past the transit corridors and the relay stations and the long reach of known space. The fleet was back at its bases, 800,000 warships, resting, waiting, ready if they were ever needed again. She hoped they were never needed again. She did not think the galaxy would make that mistake twice. The vendor next to her was an old man who had been on New Leap since at the beginning 11 years ago, when the first transports had landed and people had looked at the red soil and the blue rivers and decided to make something of it. He recognized Das. Most people on the colony did. He was not saying it to her. Specifically, he was saying it to the square, to the market, to the morning. Yes, she said. He nodded. He went back to arrange his fruit. She ate hers in. The sun, the colony lived, the stars were quiet, and in every government building, in every civilization within broadcast range, in every intelligence file and military briefing and strategic assessment of every species that had watched what happened, and GT, in all of it there was a new entry, a new fact, a new line in the calculation of what was and was not worth doing. It said, do not touch what belongs to humans. It said, they will come, had said all of them,